All right, we are now live for another reading from my book, Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, the 1930s Christian Philosophy Debates in France. And today we are going to be doing a kind of shorter reading, and it's on this section, Historical Development and, there we go, Phases of the Christian Philosophy Debates. So not quite 10 pages, starts on page 39, finishes up on page 46. And next time, we'll go into a longer section. And then after this, we will have some Q&A and discussion about the book, the topics. We won't be doing a lot of general stuff. This is not an AMA, so this is a focused reading specifically on this work. All right, so with no further ado, historical development and phases of the Christian philosophy debates. Commentators on the debates have occasionally distinguished stages or phases of the debates, articulating them historically as well as thematically. More typically, studies of the debates have concentrated on main themes of the interlocutor's position synchronically, rather than attending to the diachronic development and spread of the debates and the interplay between the positions. The brief history provided here aims to assist further study of the debates by filling in this gap of perspective about the 1930s period. It also attempts to extend this history by distinguishing additional phases of scholarship on the debates, reappropriation, and further development of positions, further new initiatives in Christian philosophy, and the later and smaller debates and discussions about the issue. While acknowledging the inherent artificiality of imposing clean dividing lines on a field of intellectual interactions as multifaceted, as intertangled as these debates, such division remains a useful device for the sort of study in the history of ideas provided in outline by this section. The debates begin 1931. The first phase of the debates runs from the March 1931 meeting of the Société Française de Philosophie to Blondel's Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale article near the end of the year. As pointed out earlier, three main positions on Christian philosophy are represented in presentations and published work during this early phase of the debate: the rationalist, the Gilson-Maritain, and the Blondelian ones. Gilson brings up and criticizes theologist, fideist, and neo-scholastic positions against Christian philosophy, but during this phase, these positions are not yet actively championed. During this portion of the debates, the main forums are the closely associated Société Française de Philosophie and the Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale. While few notices of the discussion and issues appear in other journals, and Régis Jolivet publishes 2 books bearing on Christian philosophy, these will draw little notice during the debates. Both of the rationalists take part in the Société Française de Philosophie session, which was clearly set up by Xavier Léon to be a primarily tag team bout between 2 rationalists and 2 Thomists. Brehier's provocative article, Is There a Christian Philosophy? And Braunschweig's first installments of De la Vraie et Fausse Conversion, not yet translated, are published early on in the year. Gilson sets out and defends his position at length during the Société Française de Philosophie session, and then heads off to begin delivering the first installation of his Gifford lectures, a first selection of which is published that year in the journal Vie Intellectuelle. Maritain provides his position's first systematic articulation along lines he will not change, but merely clarify and add to in coming years. Blondel engages both rival positions in his 2 pieces published that year, and begins developing his larger study, Le Problème de la Philosophie Catholique. Blondel's work on that volume, Gilson's own on the spirit of medieval philosophy, and Maritain's reworking of his Société Française de Philosophie contribution into a lecture given at Louvain in December provide a bridge of continuity between the first and second phases. The debates expand, 1932-1933. The second phase of the debates begins conveniently enough at the start of 1932 and ends just before the Société Thomiste meeting in September 1933. During this phase, several important developments take place. Foremost among these is the just mentioned publications by Gilson, Maritain, and Blondel of three classic book-length works articulating robust positions on Christian philosophy, providing reference points for future well-informed systematic study on the subject. Maritain further adds to his Louvain lecture, publishes it in the Revue Néo-Scolastique de la Philosophie, now beginning to assume an important role, and then expands it into his book-length study essay on Christian philosophy. Blondel not only publishes his book, but discusses it with 6 other philosophers in the November 1932 Société d'études philosophiques session. The rationalists drop out of the discussion, making no further significant contributions. And from this phase on, the debates are clearly between Christian, mainly though not exclusively Catholic interlocutors. In compensation, several new positions in their own right, those of Marcel and Soriot, are added. A number of other interlocutors, including Sertillange, Bourne, and Chenu, make smaller contributions to the debates in a variety of journals, and others publish pieces taking up one major interlocutor's position or another's. Foreign interest in the topic of Christian philosophy and in the ongoing French discussions begins to manifest itself. Further development of the debates, 1933 to 1936. The Société Thomiste session provides a convenient beginning point for the third phase of the debates, since it signals the real entrance of neo-scholastic opponents of Christian philosophy. Fixing the other terminus at the end of 1935 is an admittedly somewhat more arbitrary but still defensible decision. A number of new developments, at least in embryo, are concentrated in the report of the 1933 Société Thomiste session. The two main presenters, Forrest and Motte, articulate Thomist positions for Christian philosophy and argue the case for compatibility between the Gilson, Maritain, and Blondel positions. In a lengthy contribution, Sertillange begins to set out his own position, elaborating it in greater detail later in this phase. A number of neo-scholastics set out positions against Christian philosophy during the session, Masnovo and Mondonnet getting into argument with Gilson on the matter and prefiguring Noël's later article by using categories of Husserlian phenomenology to argue against Christian philosophy's rigor. While not speaking much during the Société Thomiste session, the young von Steenbergen would afterward articulate the strongest neo-scholastic position against Christian philosophy. Many other Francophone philosophers and theologians contribute interesting pieces to the debates from many different perspectives. Quite a few Thomists, including Bruno de Solage, Yves Simon, André Marc, Pedro de Coq, M.T.L. Penido, and Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, take positions for or against Christian philosophy. A number of other thinkers, most notably Henri Gouillet, Blaise Romeyer, and Louis-Paul Cochet, represent other currents of Catholic philosophy. Prefiguring a later set of debates, 3 Reformed Protestant philosophers and theologians, Jacques Bois, Pierre Guérin, and Arnold Raymond, publish articles engaging the controversy. The Jewish philosopher Leon Shestov's first installment of Athens at Jerusalem marks the first and only intervention of a fideist into the debates proper. Blondel, Gilson, and Maritain also continue to develop aspects of their positions further, the latter in Science and Wisdom. Blondel publishes the articles Towards an Integral Philosophy and Office du Philosophe, while Gilson delivers lectures deliberately engaging Protestant conceptions of Christian philosophy, published later in 1936 as Christianity and Philosophy. By 1936, however, it becomes apparent the Francophone debates are drawing to a close, evidenced by examples such as the title made use Le bilan d'un débat philosophique, réflexion sur la philosophie chrétienne, and the tendency of other articles, for example, those by Simon, Romeyer, and de Lubac, to summarize the debates, lay out the agreements attained, and suggest further topics. At the same time, foreign interest in the debates and discussion of Christian philosophy continues steady, generating literature in Italian, Spanish, German, English, and Latin. and contributions in 5 different forums. The Thomist Society of Ottawa discusses the issue in 1933, and the Dutch one in 1934. The 8th International Congress of Philosophy and the 2nd International Thomist Congress see several presentations on the issue. And finally, in 1936, the American Catholic Philosophical Association includes several presentations on the subject. After the 1930s debates, a fallow period, 1937 to 1946. After the debates proper, one can still distinguish a set of consecutive periods in the last and current century in which further developments bearing on the issue of Christian philosophy, and to a lesser extent the 1930s debates, continue to take place. Although in this first post-debate phase, there is a marked decline of interest in the topic of Christian philosophy, capped by the dislocations, other preoccupations, lack of communications, and shortages during the years of World War II, scholars continue to revisit the issues. Gilson and Blondel, in particular, published further works that, while no longer bearing as immediately on Christian philosophy, nevertheless developed their positions further within the larger context of their philosophical works as wholes. Several articles and books on Christian philosophy are published by other interlocutors, and Alex Renard publishes one of the first book-length studies on the debates. 2 theologians, Karl Rahner and Emil Brunner, briefly examine the debates and the issue in their works. Interestingly, reflection on Christian philosophy by several Francophone Reformed Protestant philosophers continues on during this period. New debates and renewed perspectives, 1947 to 1970. The post-World War II years witnessed renewed interest in the issue of Christian philosophy, spawning a sizable but increasingly varied body of literature. Until his death in 1949 and in several posthumously published works, Blondel occasionally revisits the topic, as von Steenbergen, Maritain, and Gilson continue to do through their long careers. The 4 bodies of work had come to be treated as representative of now classic positions on Christian philosophy, and a genre of international secondary literature begins to proliferate, continuing on to the present day, consisting of articles, dissertations, and books, more or less successfully examining, championing, criticizing, harmonizing, or extending these positions. André Ayan supplies an example of this approach, providing exposition of Blondel's early philosophy in one article, arguing complementarity of Blondel's Maritain's positions in another, and discussing the status of Anselm's and Aquinas' thought as Christian philosophy. In one particularly interesting volume, Étienne Gilson, Philosophe de la Chrétienté, several interlocutors in the 1930s debates contributed pieces reflecting on Gilson's contributions to understanding Christian philosophy. For a considerable portion of the new literature on Christian philosophy, the 1930s debates and their main positions continued to provide key starting points, vocabulary, and concepts, and touchstones for further reflection and study. Although discussions on the scale of the 1930s debates never again take place during this 5th period, several sustained discussions about Christian philosophy do occur. The longest and largest of these are carried out by Reformed Protestant thinkers, spurred particularly by Roger Mel's 1940 study, The Condition of the Christian Philosopher, but re-engaging the current of Protestant thinkers and articles from earlier phases. In this case, we can legitimately speak of a 1940s to 1960s Francophone Protestant Christian philosophy debate running in parallel to, but seemingly little involved with, the Dutch and later Dutch-American Reformed tradition of Christian philosophy. In addition to those mentioned earlier, Edmond Rochedieu, Paul Ricoeur, and Pierre Thévenaz become involved in these discussions. Another set of much more loosely connected discussions occasionally takes place in American circles, involving, among others, Dietrich von Hildenbrand and Germain Grisez. As a last note, the philosopher and biblical scholar Claude Trémontant develops at great length and in considerable detail an interesting new Catholic position on Christian philosophy, particularly in his Études de métaphysique biblique. Christian philosophy in times of pluralism and postmodernism, 1971 to the present. It also makes sense to speak of a sixth, even yet wider and still ongoing phase, consisting in reappropriation and reinterpretation of the debate and its issues in a newly realized late modern situation of philosophical pluralism. In the present day, in this sixth phase, the possibility and the nature of Christian philosophy still remains an open, complex, and alluring question. Nearly every position developed in the course of the debates finds its present-day proponents, and some possess quite erudite expositors. There are, of course, some new philosophical developments, new ways of approaching the issues, but much of the possible discussions or investigations of Christian philosophy's possibility or nature, particularly those carried out by authors unfamiliar with the 1930s debates, inevitably remains within the shadows cast by the earlier and more monumental stages. In recent years, more closely focused philosophical attention has been devoted to certain basic issues, phenomena, and conditions that were often overlooked by previous generations of philosophers, and that are of interest and relevance to Christian philosophy just as much as to philosophy in general. Adrian Pepperzak, for example, recently wrote, "I am aware that these questions have been debated before, particularly in France 60 years ago, but the situation has changed profoundly since the heyday of Neo-Thomism. Neo-scholasticism has disappeared. Exegesis and history have shown how many meanings the word Christian has. The modern idea of an autonomous philosophy has made room for conceptions according to which philosophy is always rooted in pre-philosophical soil and fed by non-philosophical moods, mores, and traditions." While his contention that neo-scholasticism has vanished is contestable, the other developments he signals set contemporary reflection on Christian philosophy in novel conditions. Christian philosophy faces new intellectual and cultural opponents, challenges and temptations, possible interlocutors, and tasks. Fortunately, it also possesses a treasury of considerable resources and a stable of erudite champions, including in recent years Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI. To conclude these speculations about this last phase extending into the millennium, I wish to stress that labeling it as a sixth phase of the Christian philosophy debates indicates a commitment to interpreting the considerable body of contemporary literature on Christian philosophy as making points of contact with the debate's positions, interlocutors, and interpreters within intellectual and historical frameworks generated by the 1931-1936 phases of the Christian philosophy debates. These earlier stages, however, as I hope these introductions have shown, and as I am confident the translations following will display, we're not a closed intellectual arena that can be set aside as a finished historical product for three important reasons, each of which also applies to the present stage. First, some of the issues and the controversies brought to light are so basic, so fundamental, so inherent in and relevant to any contemporary philosophy that aims at adequate self-reflection that they possess a certain sort of inexhaustible perenniality. Second, approaches to these matters had their roots and stimulation in a wider and yet living past context of Christian life and culture, one that, like all living past, carried itself forward into the present of the 1930s and still continues on into our new millennium. Third, as the best of the debates literature indicates, the reflexive projects of Christian philosophy must not only appropriate, reinterpret, and thereby continue past intellectual traditions, and not only so deepen their analyses to strive for both perennial philosophical achievements and to enter into the mysteries upon which these rest, they must also in their philosophical work enter into dialogue with the wide range of interlocutors, even those bitterly hostile and perversely unwilling that Providence has set in their path. These are precisely what the debate's best interlocutors did in the 1930s. They thus provide us with time-tested models and intellectual frameworks for us present-day Christian philosophers to take up these tasks in our turn. So that's the end of that section. The next section that we'll be going into for the reading, it continues on with the historical introduction, but it's the thematic introduction, outlines of positions articulated during the debates, and we'll begin with that in the next session. So let me see what we've got up here. The monarch wants to thank me for the content I've put out. I'm glad to read that. Fabian asks, are you part of any other clubs that meet to discuss philosophy? Yes, but that's a research project for you to carry out online. You can go to my social media about the ones that I participate in. Elijah, I've been reading books on Blondel lately. I'd be grateful to hear of your ideas of radical differences between Blondel's account of action and Hegel's essential differences, similarities. Hegel doesn't have an account of action. There's one part, essential difference right there. Hegel discusses action at many points, but he doesn't have an account of action. By the way, probably the most interesting parts of his discussions, I would say, that aren't in the philosophy of right, take place in the phenomenology, in the morality section of spirit. Blondel devotes a very different kind of phenomenological and systematic attention that is dialectical, but not dialectical necessarily in Hegel's way. Don't let the being called the French Hegel or the Catholic Hegel mislead you into thinking that they're basically on the same level when it comes to these sort of things. Retro Gamer, knowing nothing of the content of the debates or issues is a very dry history. I look forward to the translation. Get the book. Don't complain, right? If the book is easy enough to get your hands on, and the translations are contained in the book, not just translation, but translations. If you find it dry, maybe this isn't something to join in on. Maybe it's better just to read it. All right, post-structuralist. Scholastic seems to mean something other than Catholic school of theology. There is no Catholic school of theology. There are Catholic schools and movements of theology. There has never, ever been, throughout the entire history of the church, one single Catholic school of theology. Scholastic or neo-scholastic are referring to taking things from the scholastic period, so Abelard and Anselm on forward, all the way to people like through Thomas and Albert, all the way through to Duns Scotus and Occam, and actually beyond, John of Poinsot and people like that, Suarez. So in the one thing in the Attorney Patris, this really important encyclical document that Pope Leo XIII brought out. It was urged that there should be a return to scholastic philosophy and that there should be institutional support for that, right? And so part of that institutional support consisted in new academic institutions like Louvain. And so, and also like, the Revue Neo-Scholastique, right? So new journals that would focus on reinterpreting not just Thomas Aquinas, but also all these other scholastic authors. Anselm isn't really a scholastic. He's still a monastic writer, and he's kind of sui generis. Abelard is clearly, somebody who falls within that scope. And then there's many other writers as well, some of whom are better known now, like, for example, Henri of Ghent, who I know people who do work on, but wasn't being read that much at that time. So there's this incredible effort being put in at certain places in reviving not just Thomistic, but other scholastic thought. And it was done largely by Catholics. The interesting thing is now, Aquinas is probably being read by just as many Protestants as he is by Catholics, because many of them have recognized they shouldn't have thrown that baby out with the bathwater of dismissing Catholic thought. And Thomists were all over the map when it came to these Christian philosophy debates. Many of them were very influenced by Maurice Blondel, Antonin Sertillanges, Bruno de Solage, some classic examples of that, Henri de Lubac. Thomism was kind of a lingua franca that you were stuck with at the time. So that's probably enough about scholasticism. Ricky, I wrote exegesis paper once and never again. I have no idea what that means. Tyler Sass, crushing, love my work. Well, that's great. So questions about what we're talking about here, the book, the work that went into it, the landscape, intellectual of the time. What have we got? Because that's what we're focused on here. This is not a general AMA. This is me taking time out of my day to do a live reading and then talk with all of you about some of the discussions. General questions on Kojève and his reading of Hegel, save that for an AMA. If we don't have any other questions or comments or discussion specifically about that, I'll just give you a preview of what is to come. There's another about 50 pages or so of introduction. The next sections are going to be the rationalists, which are Émile Brillet and Leon Brunschwig, Revelation, Generative of Reason, a section on Etienne Gilson, Philosophy in a Christian State, Jacques Maritain, Catholic Philosophy, Maurice Blondel, The Paradox and the Scandal, Gabriel Marcel, Neo-Scholastic Thomist Opponents of Christian Philosophy, Thomist Proponents of Christian Philosophy, and non-Thomist Proponents of Christian Philosophy. And that takes us up to page 91. And then once we're through those, which will probably take, a few sessions, I'm going to start reading some of the 12 different chapters of translated material from this, starting with Émile Brillet, finishing up with Léon Noël. And it might be helpful for people to actually get the book and read ahead. If you don't want to, then you get to hear me reading through it. Thomas says, just tuned in. Is there anything you learned, took away from your work you didn't realize before going into it? Yeah, I mean, this was a project that took me from about 2003 to 2011, and the research that was done on it took place roughly between 2003 to 2008. Continued a little bit more after that. Much of the research was done at the Notre Dame Hesburgh Library. Talked about that a little bit in some of the earlier sessions. And yeah, I mean, I started out not knowing that the debate included about 50 different people, including about, we could say 10 major positions on the debates. And that, I didn't even suspect the existence of many of the documents that I later decided to include for translation in here. This was like, in Francophone circles, this was like one of the key philosophical topics of discussion for a good 5 years, and probably would have continued on longer had World War II not intervened. So, I've actually got a video on this, so I don't need to go into this too much. The one that I remastered recently and released about National Library Week and the whole project, how I ended up doing the research. So a lot of that was surprise after surprise after surprise, pleasant surprises. Post-structuralist, are you getting back to Ricoeur? I never left Ricoeur, but I'm not getting back to him in the sense of like doing more work on Ricoeur. He's just an ever-present person on my shelf who I take down every once in a while. Tyler says, Aquinas seems to fall in alignment with Aristotle. Would this make Aristotle a proto-Christian? No, it would not. Any more than it would make Cicero a proto-Christian. I don't know why we'd want that to even be the case. And Aristotle doesn't have an emphasis on logos and its essential divinity. You have in mind instead the Neoplatonists and the Stoics on that matter, not Aristotle. Aquinas is actually out of alignment with Aristotle on many topics, where he says that Aristotle got things wrong. One thing would be on the eternity of the world. All right, any questions about the book, the topics? Otherwise, I'm going to bring this one to a little bit of an early close, and we'll have longer reading next time, which will be happening this coming weekend. Ricky says, how did the debate impact the critical explanation and interpretation of Christian text? I don't know what you exactly have in mind with that. It didn't. It was about Christian philosophy, not primarily about Christian texts. So, all right, let's wrap it up. Thanks for everybody for showing up for this one. And like I said, we'll have plenty more coming up down the line. There are many more readings. If we do about 10 to 15 pages at a time, I think this will certainly take me the rest of the summer and maybe even into fall. So have a great day wherever you are, and I'll see you at the next one.